Now with this problem, what we're going to do here is we're going to run through 5 steps to actually graph this parabola. So the first step says determine whether the parabola opens upward or downward. Now again, this is in graphing parabolas here, or graphing quadratic functions. So what we're going to do here is we're going to determine if it opens up or down. And if you didn't know, the way you tell is by A. Now remember the form here. The form we have it in is f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So this tells me a is -4, b is -6, and c is 2 if I was going to think of them as the numbers. So what happens here is when I look at a is what we call the leading coefficient. And that tells us if this parabola opens upward or downward. If it's positive, it opens upward. So that means the u is going to be like we normally see it in general. If it's negative, then that means it opens downward. So it's going to look like that. So this ends up opening downward. So the first step, we know that it opens downward because the leading coefficient is negative. If it was positive, it would open upward. So anyways, that's our first step. So step 1, and we can write that down here, so opens downward. So now step 2 says find the equation of the axis of symmetry. Now we haven't talked about this yet. Now we'll get a little bit more technical about the actual graphing of this function now. So how that works is, if you think about a parabola, it's this U shape. Now I'll draw it a little bit more accurate in a sense that we know this one goes downward. So that idea of symmetry, think about symmetry. It's where the line is where if I flip it or I reflect it, it's going to give me the same picture. So if I move every point over here and then every point on this side over to the other side, I would get the same graph. So they call that line the equation of the axis of symmetry. Now think about this. If I could find the x value of the vertex, then I would have that equation of a line, because the equation of a line is going to be a vertical line. So it's x equals some number. I wouldn't say a. I guess I should stay away from that because we use a over here with the functions. So we'll call it something else, but that's the idea. We'll call it c. Oh, I got a c too. We'll call it d. Okay, so x is just equal to some number. So if we can find that number here, then we have the equation of the axis of symmetry, where we have this line of symmetry. So if we recall the formula to find the x value when we have it, or I should say the x value of the vertex, when we have it in this form here, notice, here it is, and this was our previous example. So our h is equal to -b over 2a. And our k is simply saying, hey, I plug that in, and then I can find the k. So that's all we're going to do for this problem. So now for this one, that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to take x equals -b over 2a. So now when I plug in b here, do you guys remember what I said b was? B was -6. So this is -6. And I'm just writing everything out here so you can see it all play out here. So this is 2 times an a is -4. So what we get here is +6 over -8, which simplifies to -3/4. So our x equaling -3/4 is the equation of the axis of symmetry. And again, we know that's the x value of our vertex, and that's going to give us that vertical line that goes right through that vertex, and that's what we're looking for here. Now, step 3 says find the vertex, and we already did half of the work because we found the x value of the vertex. So 3, we have our x value, which is -3/4, comma, because think about this, if we're going to find the vertex, it's an ordered pair. So now we have to find the y value. And to find the y value is we'd have to plug this in for the x into the original function here, and then I should say the original function here, and then we can get the y value when we plug in -3/4 for x. So f of negative 3/4 is going to give me negative 4 times negative 3/4 squared minus 6 times negative 3/4 plus 2. And that's going to give us 17/4. So that's going to be our y value of our vertex. So again, you just plug it in. Now for step 4, it says here, find the y-intercepts. Find the point symmetric to the y-intercept across the axis of symmetry. So we'll talk about this point when we graph it, because I think it'll be a better visual to talk about it then. So we're not going to worry about finding the point symmetric to the y-intercept across the axis of symmetry yet. When we graph it, it'll make a lot more sense if you do not understand what that's saying. So we're going to find the y-intercept only for that step 4. So to find the y-intercept, that's where I cross the y-axis. And if I'm on the y-axis there, that means my x is 0. So my x would have to be 0 here. And then essentially we just plug it in and get the y value for that. So that's going to actually be 2. So that's my y-intercept for 4. Now let's take a look at step 5. 5 says, find the x-intercepts. Find additional points if needed. So we're not going to worry about the additional points right now if needed. We're just going to worry about finding the x-intercept. So that means if it's the x-intercept, that means it's on the x-axis. And if it's on the x-axis, that means the y's are 0. Or that would also mean my f of x is 0 because f of x equals y. So I would have the equation, and I'm just going to write this below here, 4x squared minus 6x plus 2 equals 0. So I just have to solve this equation for x. And you know, most of the time we deal with these parabolas, we get 2 answers. Well, we don't have to. We could get 1 answer or we could get 0 answers. So we're just going to solve this. I always like to try factoring first. Sometimes that's a huge benefit because factoring, if it works, it's a quick answer that I can get to. But before I start, I'm going to multiply both sides by -1. And when I do, I get 4x squared plus 6x minus 2 equals 0. So now I'm going to look at trying to factor it. Now I notice I can pull a 2 out of all 3, so I'm going to. Actually, what I'm going to do better yet is I'm going to just divide both sides by 2. And that's going to give me a 2x squared plus 3x minus 1 equals 0. So now, can I factor that? And that's what I'm going to try to do now. So this is going to be a 2x, that's going to be an x. And then what could I do to get a positive 3 there? And this is a -1 here. Now those would have to be 1s there, and 1 would have to be a plus and 1 would have to be a minus because this is a -1. So if I make this a +1 and that a -1, that's going to be -2 here, -2x. This here is going to be a positive 1x, so I'm going to get a 1x. And I end up with a 3x there. So that tells me there, I can change these around. Let's see if that works. So make this a minus and that a plus, and that's going to give me a positive 2 and a -1, so it's going to be a positive 1. And I'm supposed to get a 3x here. So the factoring isn't going to work for us here. So the other thing we can do is quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So again, we're just going to plug in a, b, and c. So our a here is 4, our b equals 6, and our c equals -2. So hopefully that's okay with you. So that's going to give us -6 plus or minus the square root. And I'm just going to write b squared, our b is 6, so I'm going to write 36 there because b squared is going to be 36. And I'm going to get a minus there, 4. My a is 4, and my c is -2. And that's all over 2 times a, which is 4. All right, so now we're just going to clean this all up here. So this is going to be -6 plus or minus the square root. And notice here that that's going to be 16 times 2, which is 32, and they're both negative. I have 2 negatives here, so that's going to turn into a plus. So this is going to be 36 plus, and again, like I said, that's 16. 16 times 2 is 32. And that's all over 8. So now, furthermore, 32 and 36, that's 68. So negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 68 over 8. So now we can simplify this because this is going to be a negative 6 plus or minus. And this square root of 68 can be simplified into 4. And I'll write it over here. Square root of 4, square root of 17. And the square root of 4 is 2. So hopefully you guys remember how to simplify radicals. If not, that was just a quick lesson. So this is 2 square root of 17 over 8. And then I can actually factor a 2 out of all 3 of those. And my answer then would be negative 3 plus or minus square root of 17 over 4. And those are 2 answers there. The 2 ordered pairs that we're going to have for this. Now remember, these are my X-Intercepts, if you lost sight of that for this long problem here. So the X-Intercepts are where my Y was 0. Remember, that's what we had here, or Y is 0, Fx. So that's going to result in my X being negative 3 plus square root 17 over 4, comma 0. All right, so hopefully that's okay with you guys. Just realize they're ordered pairs. No big deal. And I have 2 of them. So I'm going to write the other one just below. I'm just clearing a little bit of space here. So the other one's going to be negative 3 minus square root of 17 over 4, comma 0. And then we're going to graph all of these points on there. So we'll see it all come out. So for graphing, we'll need decimal approximations, but I always, when I write answers, should write the exact value. So negative 3 plus square root of 17 over 4 is what you should write for an answer. And I'm just going to write the decimal approximations for these points too, because we're going to have to graph them. So this one with the plus 17 over 4, that's going to be a 0.280776. And I'll keep it there, comma 0. And that's that one. And then the other one approximately is going to be negative 1.78078, comma 0. So that's the other one. So with those 2 together, this here is strictly for the graphing, not for an answer. So be careful. This, is what we should write for the answer for that step 5. So now we have enough information to graph this thing. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to put in all these points, all this information. So right away, we know this thing opens downward. Now, when we start to graph all these points, we're not going to really worry about that. It should complement, though, what we end up with for our values. So first off, we know x is negative 3/4. So I'm going to write that first. And let's see how far we're going out with this. Our points are going to go out to 0.1. So I'm going to stretch this out a little bit. Any shifts, horizontal shift, our vertex is going to be this one here. So there's our equation of the axis of symmetry. That's x equals negative 3/4. Okay, now we're going to graph the vertex. So that's going to be up 17/4. So that's up 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's here. There's 4, and that would be 16/4 plus 1 more 4. So it's going to be here. There's our 17/4. And then our Y-intercept, which is here, that's going to be 0.2. So there's our 0.2 here. And then remember when it said find the point symmetric to the Y-intercept across the axis of symmetry? And the reason why they do that is because I can get a point over here as well. Now keep in mind here, this distance here is 3/4. Because from 0 to negative 3/4 is 3/4. So at 3/4, where is that going to put me at? That's going to be 1/4, so 2 more fourths. So it's actually going to be right at the halfway mark here. If I'm going to go over 3/4. Hang on, let's see. Yes, that would be correct. Okay, so now that's 2 points there, and then we have our intercepts, our x-intercepts, which are the next step here, down here now. So we got our x-intercepts, and that's 0.28. So that's a little over a quarter on the positive x side. So about there. And then on the other side, it says negative 1 here, 0.78. So that's like negative 1 3/4. So there's 1 negative, and 3/4, that'll put me about there. And that's about it. That's all of our points. And we do have enough to graph this now. If you think of the points that we have, and all the information we have should be complemented by whatever we didn't use here. Now remember when I said this thing opened downward and we wouldn't use that directly, but we'll see it with all the other information. Now we see how that played out, which is very nice. And one other thing you want to do here is you want to label your points. What I mean by that, you're going to want to put the values in, the labels for the ordered pairs that you see here. So this is my vertex, so I'll write negative 3/4, comma 17/4. And that's that one. And over here on the right, we're going to have 0, 2. And that's okay. You don't have to label this one over here. But the y-intercept for sure. The x-intercepts you're going to have to label here. So this is going to be negative 3 plus the square root of 17 over 4, comma 0. And the one over here is going to be negative 3 minus the square root of 17 over 4, comma 0. So there's all of our points, and that's a complete graph. So it definitely takes a little bit of time to go through these problems.